Okay, let's unpack this. Today, we're diving into a topic that maybe at first glance might seem a bit, well, dry. Tariffs.
Yeah, definitely not the sexiest topic, usually.
But I promise you, through the incredibly unique and honestly often hilarious lens of our source material today, this isn't just an economic discussion. It really transforms into an absolutely wild ride through policy, personality, and some truly unexpected, even fantastical pronouncements from, the highest levels of government.
It's quite something.
We've assembled a collection of satirical blog posts. They come from Barackface and the Republic of Absurdia. Now, let's be clear. These aren't your typical sober economic analyses. Not at all.
No, definitely not your standard Brookings Institution paper.
Exactly. Instead, they offer this unique, critical, and often uproariously humorous perspective on recent events and the key political figures driving these trade policies. So our mission in this deep dive is really to extract the crucial insights from these, let's call them unconventional sources. We want to understand the figures at the heart of these terror strategies, the controversies they've stirred up, and the actual, or in some cases, the entirely imagined impact of their actions on the global stage.
Right. We're aiming to understand the underlying truths these satirical pieces illuminate, because satire often cuts through the noise, doesn't it?
It really does.
And that's precisely what's so fascinating here. How these sources skillfully employ satire, not just for laughs, although there are plenty of those.
Oh, yeah.
But to highlight real, often profound underlying tensions in our political landscape. They expose the friction between, say, the established rule of law and then the sometimes outsized impact of individual personality on national policy.
Huge impact.
And also how the rest of the world perceives a nation's economic strategies when they seem, well, a bit unpredictable. So as we journey through these accounts, we'll be looking not just at the what of these events, the specific declarations and actions, but critically, the why it matters. Why should you, listening right now, care about the way these policies were framed, challenged, and perceived?
That's the key question.
And it's crucial to remember, like you said, while the sources are satirical, they are reporting on actual events, actual statements, actual legal challenges. Our role, as always, is to examine all of this impartially, focusing on the factual underpinnings that the satire is built upon, to help you become truly well-informed.
Absolutely. Okay, let's get into it. #tag the deep dive. All right, our first stop on this journey through what the sources are calling the fantastical front lines of trade policy is with a figure who really takes center stage in these satirical accounts, Peter Navarro. He's described as the omniscient oracle east of the Mississippi. I mean, the accounts paint quite a vivid, almost larger-than-life picture of him, often hailing him, with tongue firmly in cheek, as a polymath. With this astonishing range of self-proclaimed expertise, spanning everything from economics to foreign policy and way beyond, it's truly something to behold.
It really is. And it kind of invites us to consider the nature of expertise in public life today, doesn't it?
It does.
Indeed, the sources present Navarro as almost this caricature of intellectual breadth. Barackface, one of the blogs, says he's universally hailed, at least in the Navarro household, plus one corner of Fox and Friends, as the greatest trade expert east of the Mississippi.
Yeah, okay.
They go on to describe him as an economist, a foreign policy savant, a geopolitical chess grandmaster, and even, quite remarkably, a sociologist specializing in the Indian caste system.
Wait, the Indian caste system? Seriously?
Seriously. And the Republic of Absurdia blog adds to this, suggesting, humorously, if Leonardo da Vinci had traded frescoes for cable news hits and sock puppets like Ron Vara, we'd have Peter Navarro.
Sock puppets like Ron Vara. We'll have to get back to Ron Vara.
Oh, we will. But that comparison, Da Vinci to Navarro, it really sets the tone for how his multifaceted expertise is portrayed as both, impressive maybe in its sheer breadth, but also at times pretty theatrical in its presentation.
Performative, almost.
Performative is a great word for it. What's truly insightful here, I think, is how this caricature highlights a recurring theme in modern politics.
Yeah.
That strategic blurring of genuine, deep expertise with, well, performative intellectualism.
Yeah.
The sources aren't just making fun of Navarro. They're inviting you to question how much of political authority, especially in really complex fields like trade or geopolitics, is built on demonstrable substance versus just the sheer audacity of self-proclaimed knowledge.
Right. How much is real expertise? How much is just confidence?
Exactly. And how susceptible public discourse can be to these these theatrical projections.
Okay, so moving from his general proclaimed genius to his specific domain, tariffs. He gets dubbed the Tariff Whisperer?
The Tariff Whisperer. I like that.
For him, tariffs aren't just these dry economic instruments. They are, as the sources put it, weapons-grade olive branches.
Weapons-grade olive branches. That's a term. It captures that sort of contradictory nature, doesn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Aggressive, but supposedly peaceful.
Totally. And he famously declared, "We're already in a trade war with China." The sources say this was delivered with an almost dramatic flair, as if he was auditioning for Game of Thrones, WTO edition.
Okay, visualizing that now.
The underlying insight here, though, seems to be how Navarro really conceptualized economic policy as this direct extension of geopolitical conflict. He moved beyond traditional economic theory into a much more aggressive confrontational stance.
Yeah, much more zero-sum, maybe.
Possibly. And the sources playfully suggest that for Navarro, tariffs were actually a form of poetry.
Poetry.
Yeah, each import duty a sonnet, each customs penalty a haiku. You could almost visualize him, they suggest, scribbling tariff schedules on parchment like medieval monks illuminating manuscripts in some hidden D.C. office.
Giving these, like, bureaucratic tools an almost sacred artisanal quality.
Exactly. This portrayal suggests a really deeply personal, almost mystical connection to tariffs, elevating them beyond mere policy tools to instruments of national will, maybe even artistic expression for him.
It's a way of showing how, in his worldview, maybe the technicalities of trade policy became imbued with this grander, almost mythic purpose. It wasn't just about economics, it was about national destiny or something.
Right, and this unique approach didn't stop at trade policy. It fundamentally reshaped his view of foreign relations, too.
Makes sense.
The sources describe him as charging into foreign policy like a bull in a china shop, or, as the Republic of Absurdia puts it, like a Costco shopper with an expired coupon loud, insistent and convinced he's right.
That's vivid.
He made it absolutely clear. We will never sacrifice our economy on the altar of foreign policy. This statement, according to the sources, basically elevated America's economic bottom line to full-blown deity status.
Wow. So economics trumps everything else. Diplomacy, alliances.
Everything. It suggests that national interest, in his view, was solely defined by immediate economic gain. The traditional tools of diplomacy you mentioned, alliances like NATO, international treaties, even just basic diplomatic discussions, seem to hold very little sway for him.
Mm-hmm.
The sources humorously sum it up. Kissinger had détente, Navarro has receipts.
Oof. That really encapsulates that shift, doesn't it? From nuanced, long-term strategic diplomacy to this very transactional, almost ledger-based approach.
Totally. If a foreign policy initiative couldn't be immediately quantified in a quarterly spreadsheet, it was dismissed as, quote, yoga, and Navarro doesn't do yoga.
Okay, so no downward dog diplomacy.
Apparently not. This highlights a very transactional, almost solely economically driven view of international relations. Complex global partnerships were reduced to quantifiable gains and losses, a huge departure from decades of diplomatic tradition.
And the insight there, I think, is how that kind of mindset risks alienating allies, simplifying these really intricate global power dynamics into just a series of bottom-line calculations. You lose the nuance, you lose the long game.
Exactly.
That's a critical observation.
Yeah.
And this transactional view, as the sources present it, it extended to his whole global worldview. He was portrayed as a geopolitical grandmaster, pawn edition.
Pawn edition.
Yeah, like he scanned the globe like a man who just discovered risk in his 70s, simplifying complex international relationships into just a game of strategic moves and counter moves.
Okay.
His pronouncements were pretty stark. India, characterized as a laundromat for the Kremlin, suggesting it was just a pass-through for Russian influence.
Wow, okay. That's blunt.
Very.
Mm-hmm.
China, of course, remained the overarching existential threat, the constant antagonist, and in his calculation, allies. Overrated enemies. Underrated.
Overrated allies, underrated enemies. That's quite a reversal of traditional foreign policy thinking.
It really is. It reveals this deeply skeptical, maybe isolationist streak, questioning the value of traditional alliances, perhaps even seeing them as liabilities rather than assets.
Mm-hmm.
The sources even highlight his rather unique bedroom metaphor diplomacy. He apparently asked, "Why is Modi in bed with Putin and Xi?"
Okay.
This colorful language, while, maybe humorous on the surface, makes complex geopolitics sound less like serious international relations and more like Love Island, Eurasia edition.
Right. It strips away all the nuance for dramatic effect.
Exactly. And the deeper insight here is how such simplistic, often provocative framing can erode trust, misrepresent complex national interests, and ultimately undermine the very diplomatic efforts a nation might need. It shows how rhetoric can not only define policy but also dictate perception, both at home and abroad.
And then, just when you think you've grasped the full spectrum of Navarro's self-proclaimed expertise and his policy approach, the sources hit us with a genuine curveball. Navarro, the sociologist.
Oh yes, the sociology detour.
This foray into a complex social system is truly, well, eye-raising. Without any apparent deep dive into anthropological study, or even, as one source dryly notes, so much as a Wikipedia binge. He made this rather bold pronouncement about India's social structures. He declared, "You've got Brahmins profiteering at the expense of the Indian people."
Just threw that out there.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
The satirical accounts vividly portray the academic world's reaction to this. They suggest Max Weber is spinning in his grave like a fidget spinner, and that anthropologists, meanwhile, are updating their resumes to apply for jobs at Taco Bell.
Ouch. It's humorous, but it's a pointed way of illustrating how he didn't just simplify complex social systems, he steamrolled them like a monster truck at a demolition derby, honking as he goes.
That's quite the image.
And the insight here is pretty profound, I think. It reveals this tendency to apply a broad, often ill-informed brushstroke to highly nuanced cultural and social issues, echoing his approach to economics and foreign policy.
Right, seeing everything through one specific, maybe simplistic lens.
Exactly. It forces us, or you the listener, to consider the dangers of policymakers venturing into complex domains without adequate research or understanding. It can lead to mischaracterizations that damage international relations or misguide domestic policy.
Which brings us back to Ron Vara. You mentioned him earlier.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
We absolutely cannot discuss Navarro's public persona without talking about the Ron Vara cinematic universe. This is truly a unique aspect of his public communication style. It borders on the surreal.
Okay, so who or what is Ron Vara?
Ron Vara was Navarro's imaginary economist alter ego, a fictional character.
Wait, imaginary?
Completely made up.
Yeah.
But here's the kicker. Navarro actually quoted Ron Vara in his own serious published books, presenting Vara's opinions as if they came from an independent expert.
No way. He quoted his own imaginary friend as an expert source.
That's essentially what the sources describe. They call it not merely deception, but performance art, suggesting that Navarro didn't just write policy papers, he created the Navarro extended universe.
Yeah.
IDU.
The NU.
The humor here is quite sharp. Barackface quipped, Marvel executives are jealous they didn't think of Ron Vara first.
Aha.
But the deeper insight this reveals is pretty serious. It's about the extent to which information can be manufactured or manipulated within political discourse.
Definitely.
The creation of a fictional authority figure just to bolster one's own arguments raises significant questions about academic integrity, media literacy, and the very nature of truth in public statements.
It really blurs the line between fact and fiction.
Utterly blurred. It highlights how the line between factual reporting and creative self-endorsement can just disappear. It invites you, the listener, to be much more critical of the sources and authorities cited in policy debates.
Always good advice.
This phenomenon, which the sources capture so vividly, speaks volumes about the performative aspects of modern politics and the challenge of discerning verifiable expertise from invention.
Okay, so after witnessing Peter Navarro's grand designs, his sort of theatrical approach to trade, and even his fictional expert, you might wonder, could such an expansive self-image and the policies it spawned actually stand up to rigorous scrutiny, like real legal scrutiny?
A very fair question.
And our sources reveal that this wasn't just a question for political pundits, it became a question for the very foundation of American law. We now turn to the dynamic between the Tariff Twins, that's President Trump and Peter Navarro, and their head-on collision with the judiciary.
The immovable object meets the, well, maybe not irresistible force, but certainly a loud one.
Right. This wasn't just a policy debate. It was a fundamental constitutional showdown that really challenged the very limits of executive power.
That's a crucial framing, because what's fascinating here is how the sources present these legal challenges as the courts pushing back against what they termed a make-believe monarchy.
Make-believe monarchy. Okay.
Multiple judicial bodies, 2 initial courts, and then a federal appeals court unequivocally ruled that the sweeping tariffs imposed by the administration were illegal, just flat out illegal.
And what was the core reason?
The core finding was stark. The president had overstepped his authority by using a 1970s law to slap tariffs on nearly every major U.S. trading partner.
A 1970s law. Which one?
To really understand the court's stance, we need to look closer at that specific law, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEPA.
IEPA.
Enacted in 1977, IEPA was designed for very specific, dire national emergencies. Think targeted sanctions against a hostile regime, freezing assets during a crisis, responding to an immediate threat to national security.
So serious stuff, not just general trade policy.
Exactly. Its power is meant to be surgical, limited, and used in truly extraordinary circumstances. The judiciary essentially found that applying IEPA to slap tariffs on nearly all trading partners was like using a fire extinguisher to water your garden.
A complete misapplication.
A complete misapplication of its intended limited authority. This ruling affirmed that the executive branch fundamentally overstepped its bounds, encroaching on Congress's constitutionally mandated role in regulating commerce and imposing taxes.
Which is Congress's job, right? The power of the purse.
Precisely.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's important to clarify, though, this ruling applied to those general global tariffs. It did not affect specific tariffs like those imposed under Section 232.
Section 232, that's the national security one.
That's the one. Used for steel and aluminum, and they were exploring it for automobiles, pharmaceuticals, semiconductors. Those were based on distinct national security grounds and weren't touched by this particular ruling about IEPA.
Got it. So the IEPA ruling was about the broad, sweeping tariffs.
Correct.
Okay, so how did the Tariff Twins react when multiple courts told them their signature policy was illegal?
The reaction from Trump and Navarro to these decisive court decisions was, as the sources highlight, one of strong condemnation, disbelief, and, frankly, dire, almost apocalyptic predictions.
Apocalypse. Over tariffs.
Pretty much. President Trump took to social media declaring, without tariffs and all of the trillions of dollars we've already taken in, our country would be completely destroyed and our military power would be instantly obliterated.
Trillions with a T.
Trillions with a T. He went on to predict widespread economic chaos, stating, if a radical left court is allowed to terminate these tariffs, almost all of this investment and much more will be immediately canceled, and that the U.S. would, in many ways, become a third world nation with no hope of greatness again.
Wow, that's extreme.
Extremely extreme. Peter Navarro echoed this sentiment, describing the court's decision as weaponized partisan injustice at its worst, and dramatically asserting that a loss at the Supreme Court would be the end of the United States.
The end of the United States.
That's what he reportedly said. What's insightful here is the sheer magnitude of the claims. And it's worth noting, as you picked up on, the vast discrepancy between Trump's claim of trillions of dollars in tariff revenue.
Yeah, that number seemed high.
Very high. When total U.S. imports in the previous year were only around $3.3 trillion. The actual collected tariffs historically amounted to tens of billions, maybe low hundreds of billions over time, but certainly not trillions annually.
Okay, so a huge exaggeration.
A massive rhetorical inflation. It served to magnify the perceived stakes and demonize the judiciary, presenting the tariffs as this absolute economic lifeblood rather than just one policy tool among many. It really highlights how political rhetoric can dramatically diverge from economic reality, especially when facing legal challenges to executive power.
That rhetorical inflation is striking. But what specifically was the constitutional principle at stake here? Were they just misunderstanding the judiciary's role, or was there a deeper political strategy in how they responded to the idea that Congress controls taxes?
That brings us directly to the constitutional debate at the very heart of this. The sources underscore the judiciary's crucial role in affirming Congress's authority over taxation. That power is explicitly granted to the legislative branch in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution.
The power of the purse. Foundational stuff.
Absolutely foundational. As the sources pointedly state, the Tariff Twins genuinely seem shocked that the judiciary pointed out tariffs are taxes paid by Americans and that taxes require Congress.
They seem shocked by basic civics.
According to these satirical accounts, yes. This wasn't some minor procedural point. It was a fundamental principle of American governance, established by the founders specifically to prevent executive overreach and ensure representation in taxation. No taxation without representation, right?
Right.
The courts effectively argued that it was unlikely that Congress had intended to grant the president nearly unlimited authority to impose tariffs as part of that law, meaning IEPA. They were challenging the idea of presidential overreach in an area explicitly assigned to the legislative branch.
So separation of powers in action.
Exactly. The insight here is how critical that separation of powers is, especially when economic policy, which directly affects citizens' wallets, is concerned. This judicial pushback demonstrated that even immense presidential power operates within established legal boundaries, and that those boundaries are ultimately interpreted and enforced by the courts.
So if IEPA was the wrong tool, were there other legal avenues the president could have used for tariffs, but maybe with more rules?
That's exactly right. And the sources also delineate the limitations of other tariff laws that were, or could have been, available. These showcase the specific checks and balances Congress built into the system precisely to prevent arbitrary power.
Okay, like what?
For instance, Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, the national security one we mentioned.
Right, steel, auto.
Exactly. That one requires extensive consultations and investigations by the Commerce Department to determine if imports genuinely threaten national security. The president can impose tariffs if commerce finds imports threaten to impair national security, meaning they could weaken our defense or critical infrastructure.
And that takes time, right? It's not instant.
It takes months, sometimes even a year. It often involves public hearings, detailed economic analyses. This legal avenue, by design, prevents a president from just arbitrarily raising and lowering tariffs on a whim.
Okay, so process matters there. Any others?
Sure. Section 122 of the Trade Act of 1974 allows for up to 15% tariffs globally, but only for a limited period, 150 days, and only in response to serious balance of payments issues. Very specific condition.
Limited scope, limited time.
Right. And then there's Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974. That's used for broad tariffs in response to unfair trading practices by foreign governments. Think intellectual property theft, things like that. But again, it mandates prior consultation, investigation, and often negotiation with the offending country first.
So more process, more steps.
Exactly. These existing legal frameworks are designed to ensure that trade policy, particularly imposing taxes like tariffs, is a carefully considered, deliberative, and transparent process. It's not subject to immediate, unchecked executive decree.
So the takeaway from these alternatives is that Congress intentionally put guardrails around presidential power on trade.
Precisely. Anticipating the very kind of unilateral action that the courts ultimately struck down when IEP was used improperly.
Okay, so after these legal setbacks, multiple courts saying, no, you can't do that, the judiciary making its rulings crystal clear, you might naturally assume the administration would, I don't know, adjust course? Find one of those other legal avenues, maybe?
That would be the logical assumption, wouldn't it?
Yeah. Well, our sources describe a truly bizarre phenomenon that followed the era of phantom tariffs.
Phantom tariffs sounds spooky.
A little. These were policies declared into existence by the administration, often with great fanfare, but with zero actual legal effect. They'd been struck down. It's a remarkable example of policy as, quite literally, performance art.
Where the declaration itself seemed to be the main point.
Exactly. A theatrical display where the declaration seemed the goal and the real-world implications were. Well, maybe just for those observing the spectacle and trying to figure out what was real.
Indeed. The sources vividly illustrate this by saying Trump did not get the memo. They describe his reaction to the court rulings. He saw the memo, apparently balled it up, threw it at an aide, and posted on Truth Social at 3:17 a.m.
Sounds about right for the platform.
The initial rulings themselves had described these tariffs as unconstitutional, unenforceable, and vaguely written in Sharpie.
Written in Sharpie, okay.
From that point on, the nation entered what the sources dubbed the Age of Phantom Tariffs. None of them legally existed, having been struck down or never properly instituted through the legally required processes we just discussed.
But they kept announcing them.
But that didn't stop the continuous announcements. They were declared night after night with the consistency of raccoons rummaging through a dumpster, announcing ever more deranged tariffs on Truth Social.
Raccoons through a dumpster.
It paints this picture of a relentless, almost ritualistic series of declarations profoundly divorced from legal reality. The insight here is how a political narrative can persist, seemingly independent of legal or factual constraints. It emphasizes that performative aspect of modern governance, where declarations can sometimes overshadow tangible action.
Okay, give us some examples. How absurd did these phantom tariffs get?
Oh, they got creative. The examples are frankly quite absurd and really drive home the satirical point while simultaneously highlighting the perceived level of detachment from reality.
Lay 'em on us.
Okay, we hear about a 1,000% tariff on spaghetti imports from Italy. The justification. Italy wasn't even nice to us during the Revolutionary War.
In the Revolutionary War.
Okay. This lampoons the tendency to invoke historical grievances, however anachronistic, to justify present-day policy. Then there's the 200% tariff on Norwegian waffles.
Norwegian waffles, is that a big import?
Apparently not. It prompted a confused statement from Norway. We don't export waffles.
Huh. So, zero research involved.
Seemingly. The absurdity continues with a 500% tariff on Mordor steel.
Mordor, as in Lord of the Rings.
As in Lord of the Rings. To which Tolkien scholars reportedly protested, it's a fictional realm.
You don't say.
This particular example pushes the boundary of reality into outright fantasy, serving as a powerful metaphor for the perceived unreality of the policies being declared. And perhaps most creatively, a tariff on the French accent.
A tariff on an accent? How would that even work?
Trump apparently insisted, we'll charge them every time they say croissant instead of crescent roll. This points to the highly subjective and almost punitive nature of some of these declarations, targeting cultural elements rather than economic goods.
Those are just the beginning, aren't they?
Oh, there's more. The sources also mention a 2,000% tariff on Finnish snow.
Finnish snow. How do you tariff snow?
A pronouncement that utterly ignores geographical and logistical realities, yes. And a 300% tariff on Swiss chocolate milk cows.
Tariffing the cows themselves.
To which Swiss officials politely clarified that cows are not export products. These fantastical examples, while comical, underscore a serious underlying critique. The casual disregard for basic economic principles, international trade logistics, even the laws of nature.
Okay, this is getting wild. Any more?
How about a 1,000% tariff on Atlantis imports?
Atlantis, the mythical underwater city.
That's the one, because as Trump claimed, fish people have been robbing us.
Fish people, right.
This plunges into pure fiction, highlighting the fabrication of perceived enemies and economic threats. And for good measure, a per-centimeter tariff on the metric system.
Taxing centimeters. I don't know.
My personal favorite, perhaps, is the 500% tariff on Hogwarts magic wands.
From Harry Potter.
Yes, where Trump reportedly called Harry Potter a bad negotiator.
Okay, I've lost the plot now.
And to cap it all off, a 1,776% tariff on British tea made retroactive to 1773, with Trump boasting, we're finally going to win the revolution.
Retroactive tariffs to the Boston Tea Party.
It's truly a masterclass in imaginative policymaking, or at least imaginative announcements. The deeper insight here is how these declarations, however absurd, aim to create a narrative of strength and decisive action, irrespective of their legal or practical enforceability.
Right, it's about the message, not the reality.
Exactly. They were designed to resonate with a particular base, demonstrating an administration willing to take extreme measures, even if purely symbolic, to win.
So how did the people around them, the aides, justify this? There must have been some rationale offered.
The sources delve into what they called a patriotism excuse. This was the rationale offered by aides for these legally non-existent tariffs.
The patriotism excuse, okay.
One aide suggested it's about sending a message, comparing it to performance art, but with more nationalism and fewer berets.
Performance art with nationalism, got it.
This justification reveals a somewhat cynical understanding of public communication, maybe, where the act of declaring something, regardless of its truth or legality, served a political purpose, projecting an image of unwavering resolve and commitment to a nationalistic agenda.
Makes sense politically, I guess.
Another offered an even more creative justification. Technically, tariffs are taxes, and technically taxes are money. So if we keep announcing tariffs, the economy keeps growing. That's patriotism.
Wait, what? Announcing taxes makes the economy grow? That's not how economics works.
That logic is, shall we say, flawed economically, but it highlights a desire to connect these declarations to tangible, positive outcomes, even if by tenuous and specious reasoning.
Wow.
President Trump himself framed these declarations as a heroic act of resistance, stating, even if the fake courts say tariffs don't count, we count them. They're invisible tariffs, the strongest kind. China is crying, folks, crying so hard.
Invisible tariffs, the strongest kind.
It illustrates a profound disconnect from legal and economic realities, replaced by this narrative of performative strength and an assertion that belief alone could somehow manifest policy effects.
So the insight from the patriotism excuse is how easily a political machine can rationalize that gap between rhetoric and reality.
I think so. Convincing a segment of the public that declarations, however unfounded, are themselves effective forms of action, especially when framed in terms of national pride and strength.
And the main platform for all this was Truth Social.
That was ground zero. The sources hilariously described it as Tariff Central, resembling a shopping catalog of imaginary punishments.
A shopping catalog of imaginary punishments.
They paint this vivid picture of someone scrolling at 3 a.m. and finding these increasingly bizarre announcements. It became a staple of the platform. It apparently got to the point where economists, understandably, stopped analyzing these posts and instead started rating them like restaurant reviews.
Like Yelp for tariffs.
Pretty much. Offering critiques like, today's tariff was surreal but lacked depth. 3 stars.
Oh my goodness.
This illustrates how the seriousness of economic policy, a field typically grounded in empirical data and sober analysis, was transformed into something almost theatrical, subjective, even a form of dark entertainment.
Yeah, it speaks to that broader trend of how social media platforms can become these echo chambers for unverified information and declarations.
Absolutely. Where the performance of policy supplants its actual implementation. The platform itself became an active participant in this zero-effect revolution, amplifying the phantom policies and blurring the lines between executive order and satirical post.
So what was the actual outcome? All of these announcements, all this noise. What happened?
And the ultimate profound outcome of this whole spectacle was what the sources termed the zero-effect revolution.
Zero effect, meaning?
Meaning, despite the constant announcements, the fervent belief expressed by some supporters, these phantom tariffs had exactly zero effect on the economy. Prices didn't change, trade didn't shift in any measurable way.
Nothing happened.
Nothing happened. The only people truly impacted were apparently interns forced to copy-paste the announcements into press releases no journalist ever cited.
The poor interns.
Yet the narrative persisted. Supporters insisted these tariffs are working. One man even cited the apparent lack of mortar steel beams in construction projects as proof.
Because mortar steel isn't real? Oh dear.
Historians, the sources suggest, may one day label this period the tariff pantomime, a time when tariffs existed only as words, like imaginary friends.
The tariff pantomime.
The zero-effect revolution offers a profound insight into the power of narrative over reality in public discourse. So the true takeaway isn't just that these specific tariffs had no economic impact. It's how a sustained, compelling political narrative, even one divorced from legal or economic fact, can still shape public perception and rally support.
It forces you to ask, what are the real-world implications when political truth becomes just a matter of persistent declaration rather than verifiable fact?
Exactly. It highlights the challenge for informed citizens, for you, to discern between declared policy and actual measurable impact in an information environment where performance can so easily masquerade as substance.
Okay, so while these phantom tariffs might have had zero effect on our domestic economy, just existing as words on a screen, that doesn't mean they had zero effect globally, right? The administration's disregard for legal realities and its unique communication style surely didn't go unnoticed on the world stage.
Absolutely not. That's a crucial distinction.
In fact, our sources suggest that the same approach that birthed these fantastical declarations at home had very real and damaging consequences for America's international standing and diplomatic relationships.
This wasn't just about economic theory anymore. It was about global trust and the delicate fabric of alliances.
So how did our allies react, especially the Europeans?
Well, the sources highlight how the Tariff Twins largely ignored crucial international advice, particularly from our European allies. EU leaders reportedly told them flat out, you don't know what you're doing, stay in your lane.
Wow. That's incredibly blunt for diplomacy.
It really is. It underscores the growing frustration and maybe exasperation among allies who found themselves trying to navigate policy pronouncements that seemed to lack a basis in either law or traditional diplomacy.
Were there warnings from inside the administration, too?
Yes, warnings also came from within. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick apparently cautioned about potential retaliation and the unwinding of agreed-upon deals by foreign trading partners and the risk of derailing critical ongoing negotiations.
So real economic consequences feared, like retaliation.
Exactly. And this isn't just theoretical. Trade retaliation from major partners like the EU often takes the form of reciprocal tariffs on key U.S. exports. Think Harley-Davidson's, bourbon, agricultural products impacting American farmers, manufacturers, and service providers directly.
Right. It's not a one-way street.
Definitely not. Mushaba Rahman of the Eurasia Group noted that European leaders might even try to leverage the situation, saying basically, look, we'll stick with the deal, but you too implement it, and no monkey business with digital regulations and taxes.
So allies trying to protect themselves and maybe gain an advantage from the chaos.
It reveals a calculated approach by international partners to protect their own interests, amid the policy chaos, perhaps using the perceived instability as leverage. The insight here is that even if our phantom tariffs had no direct economic effect here, the announcements themselves and the underlying disregard for established norms created tangible diplomatic and economic risks from our trading partners. They viewed the situation with a mix of alarm and maybe even opportunity.
Okay, beyond Europe, the sources mention a major issue with India.
Yes, perhaps one of the most striking examples of diplomatic fallout mentioned is what they call the spectacular diplomatic disaster with India.
Spectacular disaster. Why India?
This isn't just about trade, it's about geopolitics. The United States had spent decades meticulously cultivating good relations with India, viewing it as this crucial strategic counterweight to China's growing influence in Asia.
Right, a key relationship.
A really key relationship. This involved significant diplomatic effort, economic cooperation, military exercises, all aimed at fostering a strong bilateral partnership. Yet this long-term effort reportedly resulted in a nearly complete rupture.
A complete rupture. That's huge.
Huge, with India actually cozying up to China in ways that might have seemed unthinkable just a few years prior.
What caused such a dramatic shift?
The cause, according to the sources, was Trump's bizarre pursuit of a Nobel Peace Prize.
The Nobel Prize? How does that connect to India?
He allegedly tried to bully Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi into giving him undeserved credit for a ceasefire between India and Pakistan, which is, as you know, a highly sensitive regional conflict.
Wow. Trying to insert himself into that for personal gain.
This act of personal grandstanding, attempting to hijack a delicate diplomatic situation for individual glory, apparently backfired spectacularly. The fallout was severe. The two men haven't talked since, according to the sources, a significant blow to a strategically vital relationship.
That's incredible.
The deeper insight is how deeply personal agendas and a purely transactional approach to diplomacy can undermine decades of careful statecraft. It led to a loss of influence and potentially pushed key partners towards geopolitical rivals, all for a perceived short-term political gain. It's a stark illustration of the long-term costs of performative diplomacy.
And further contributing to this erosion of global trust were Trump's often grandiose claims of economic achievements, right? The sources mention one about the EU.
That's right. These claims were frequently disputed, sometimes with open incredulity, by international partners. The sources specifically point to his assertion that the European Union is giving him $600 billion.
$600 billion from the EU.
A claim they note was news to the Europeans, who of course had no record of such a payment or agreement.
So just making numbers up.
This kind of statement, seemingly detached from verifiable reality and frequently repeated, only served to exacerbate tensions. It likely fueled the perception of him on the world stage as either misinformed or perhaps deliberately misleading.
It must have undermined credibility.
Fundamentally, it undermined the credibility of U.S. economic policy statements and made it harder for international partners to engage in good faith negotiations because the baseline for factual discussion seemed constantly in flux. This consistent gap between declared facts and reality contributed significantly to that buffoon aspect of the global perception the sources mention.
Right. The sources summed up the global view how?
Precisely. The sources paint a stark picture, concluding that the world sees him as a dangerous buffoon.
Dangerous buffoon. That's quite a combination.
They elaborate on this duality, highlighting two distinct aspects. He's described as dangerous because he runs America, an economic and military superpower, and has a fanatically supportive domestic base.
So the power makes him dangerous.
Right. His actions, however erratic or ill-conceived they might seem to others, carry the weight of immense global power, making the world nervous about potential instability. Yet he is simultaneously seen as a buffoon because he's almost surreally vain, insecure, and ignorant.
So the personality makes him seem like a buffoon.
According to these sources, yes. This combination of immense power, coupled with perceived personal failings and a disregard for traditional norms, created this potent and often concerning image on the international stage.
The danger lies in the unpredictability.
Exactly. The unpredictability of a powerful actor who seems guided by personal whims rather than established policy, while the buffoon aspect undermines the seriousness with which global leaders might otherwise approach U.S. diplomacy. This dual perception is a critical insight into how leadership style can directly influence a nation's standing and effectiveness in global affairs, regardless of its underlying strength.
And the ultimate example of this, the diplomatic low point mentioned, was the SKO summit.
Ah, yes. The epitome of this diplomatic and personal humiliation is perhaps best captured by the SKO summit snub.
SKO is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, big Eurasian group.
That's the one. A significant gathering of Eurasian political and economic leaders, think China, Russia, India, Pakistan, Central Asian states. The sources portray President Trump being personally uninvited from their summit.
Uninvited? Why?
Precisely because his beloved tariffs have been ruled illegal back home. His signature policy was null and void.
Wow. That's a direct consequence.
The satirical accounts describe him being left home like that uncle who insists hot dogs don't expire if you freeze them. A humorous image emphasizing his isolation and maybe a stubborn adherence to a flawed belief.
Yeah.
For Trump, the sources suggest tariffs were his security blanket, his magic trick, his one-word bedtime lullaby. Tariffs, tariffs, sweet, beautiful tariffs. Gone. Poof. Null and void.
So it was deeply personal for him.
It illustrates this profound personal attachment to the policy, viewing it not just as an economic tool, but as a source of power, identity, maybe even comfort. The ruling stripped him of what he perceived as his primary leverage and defining characteristic on the international stage, leading to a highly personal sense of loss.
And the satirical accounts then contrast his isolation with what was happening at the summit.
Oh, brilliantly. While Trump was reportedly alone at Mar-a-Lago, clutching a Diet Coke and rage-scrolling, the other world leaders were having a decidedly different experience. They were celebrating the very policies and relationships Trump seemed to disdain.
Like what?
Putin was described as trampoline flipping
Yeah.
in his summit bounce house.
Trampoline flipping.
A symbol of carefree, unburdened diplomacy, perhaps. Modi, the Indian prime minister whom Trump had alienated, was leading a sunrise yoga class with the mantra, "Inhale peace, exhale tariffs."
Subtle.
A clear symbolic rejection of Trump's trade policies and an embrace of a more harmonious... The leader of China was surprisingly busting moves on the dance floor, shouting, "One belt, one road, one groove."
One belt, one road, one groove. Seriously.
This imagery, well, obviously satirical, brilliantly contrasts Trump's perceived isolation and frustration with the vibrant, interconnected diplomacy happening without him.
And Trump's reaction to being excluded.
The images of him muttering, "Without tariffs, what am I? Just a guy with beautiful hair."
Yeah.
And then writing this desperate, Sharpie-penned letter to Modi begging, "Don't dance with Xi. He's not fun. Invite me. We'll do Mar-a-Lago limbo."
Mar-a-Lago limbo. Wow.
It perfectly encapsulates the personal humiliation and the performative, almost childlike nature of his approach to diplomacy, according to these accounts. The insight here is how deeply a leader can intertwine their personal identity with a policy and the profound psychological and diplomatic fallout when that policy is legally invalidated. It leaves them feeling stripped of their power and relevance on the global stage.
Okay, as our deep dive progresses, let's now zero in on a sector where tariffs, even those initially proposed as phantom, could have a very real and potentially severe impact: pharmaceuticals.
Ah, yes. Essential goods.
Exactly. The sources reveal this fascinating tension between the promise of lower drug costs, which is always a politically popular goal, and the potential for significant market disruption. This highlights how these policies aren't just about rhetoric when they touch essential goods like medicine.
This is where the rubber meets the road, so to speak.
It really illustrates the true economic and social stakes involved.
Absolutely. The sources detail President Trump's specific, substantial pharmaceutical tariff plans. Now, this category of products had been largely spared in his trade war up to that point. Usually, pharma products entered the U.S. duty-free.
Right, because we want cheap medicine.
Generally, yes. But he promised to impose hefty import taxes. The shift was potentially dramatic, going from zero tariffs to the potentiality of 200%, or even 200% more on drugs made elsewhere beyond the 15% tariff rate mentioned in some European deal drafts.
200%. That's massive for medicine.
Massive. The stated goal, of course, was to lower drug costs for Americans. It aligns with that broader, consumer-focused narrative that has perennial appeal.
How would tariffs lower costs, though? Usually taxes increase prices.
Well, this is where the economic complexities truly emerge. The underlying assumption, or maybe hope, was that by taxing foreign-made drugs heavily, it would either force foreign manufacturers to lower their prices to remain competitive in the U.S. market, or it would incentivize domestic manufacturing here in the U.S., thereby increasing supply and eventually reducing costs.
Okay, I see the theory. Pressure foreign companies or boost domestic ones.
That was the promise. However, it often overlooks the incredibly intricate realities of global pharmaceutical supply chains and market dynamics.
And the sources point out potential downsides.
Big time. This aggressive approach carried significant potential negative impacts, directly contradicting the stated goal of lower prices. The sources clearly warn that imposing stiff pharmaceutical tariffs risks the opposite. It could drive up prices for consumers rather than lowering them.
Because the cost gets passed on?
Usually, yes. Tariffs are typically paid by the importer, which is often a U.S. company distributing the drug, and those costs are frequently passed on to the consumer or the insurer, who then passes it to the consumer.
Okay, what else? Supply chains.
Furthermore, it could disrupt complex supply chains, which are globally integrated and highly specialized. You have to consider that building a single active pharmaceutical ingredient, API, the core component of a drug, often involves a multi-step chemical synthesis process. Different steps might happen in different countries, optimized for cost, expertise, regulatory compliance.
It's not all made in one place.
Rarely. A key concern was the potential to drive cheap, foreign-made generic drugs out of the U.S. market. This could lead to shortages, with lower-income households and the elderly feeling the greatest impact.
Why generics specifically?
Because generic drugs are absolutely vital for affordability. They make up the vast majority of prescriptions filled in the U.S. If tariffs make these generics unprofitable for foreign manufacturers to sell here, they might simply exit the market. That reduces competition and leaves American consumers with fewer, more expensive options.
So the intervention intended to lower prices could actually raise them and reduce access.
That's the risk highlighted. It showcases a classic economic trade-off. An intervention intended to benefit consumers could paradoxically harm them through increased costs and reduced access, especially for essential medications.
So given these serious potential downsides, how did the industry react? Did they just accept it? And the timeline, Trump suggested a short delay.
Right. The sources mentioned that Trump suggested a delay of maybe a year or a year and a half. Ostensibly, this was to give companies time to stockpile medicine and shift manufacturing to the United States.
A year and a half to move pharma manufacturing, that sounds fast.
Extremely fast. And some companies did make announcements. The sources mentioned the Swiss drug maker Roche announcing a substantial $50 billion investment in expanding its U.S. operations, while Johnson & Johnson pledged $55 billion to achieve a goal of supplying drugs for the U.S. market entirely from domestic sites.
So big money was being pledged.
Significant investments, yes. It signaled that some companies were indeed considering or perhaps making moves towards reshoring, maybe in anticipation of these policies actually happening, or just as a good PR move. But your question is the critical one. Is a year or a year and a half truly enough time for such a massive industrial shift in a complex sector like pharmaceuticals?
Seems unlikely.
That's precisely the critical question, and the answer, as highlighted by the sources and industry experts, is unequivocally no. The challenges are monumental.
Why so monumental?
Well, the sources highlight that building a pharmaceutical factory in the United States from scratch is expensive and can take several years, not just a year or two. This isn't like building a car assembly plant.
Right, much more complex.
Pharmaceutical facilities require highly specialized equipment, strictly controlled sterile environments, extensive regulatory approvals from the FDA, which take time, and a highly skilled workforce, chemists, engineers, technicians, all of which take considerable time and capital to establish.
And even if you build the factory here, what about the ingredients?
That's the other huge problem. Even domestic manufacturing doesn't entirely solve the imported ingredients problem, which is a key vulnerability in our supply chains. Jacob Jensen, a trade policy analyst cited in the material, points out that 97% of antibiotics, 92% of antivirals, and 83% of the most popular generic drugs contain at least one active ingredient that is manufactured abroad.
Wow, those percentages are staggering. 97% of antibiotics rely on foreign ingredients.
Staggering. It means even if a finished drug product, the pill or vial, is formulated and packaged in a shiny new U.S. factory, its critical active ingredients might still originate from, say, China or India. If tariffs are applied to those ingredients, the cost of domestic production still skyrockets.
So you haven't really solved the core dependency.
Not entirely, no. And the impact also differs greatly between different types of drug companies.
How so? Brand names versus generics.
Exactly. Brand name drug companies often operate with fat profit margins. This gives them more flexibility to make investments and absorb costs from tariffs. They might simply pass a portion of the increased cost to consumers or insurers while retaining significant profits.
Okay, they can handle it better. What about generics?
Generic drug manufacturers, however, operate on much, much thinner margins. Competition is fierce. They do not have flexibility to absorb significant tariff costs. The sources warn that some may decide to leave the U.S. market altogether rather than pay tariffs and face unprofitability.
And that's a problem because...
Because generics account for that staggering 92% of U.S. retail and mail-order pharmacy prescriptions. They provide the backbone of affordable healthcare for millions of Americans. The departure of generic manufacturers due to tariffs could lead to severe shortages and drastic price increases for common essential medicines. Think blood pressure meds, cholesterol drugs, basic antibiotics.
That affects a huge number of people.
A massive number. The underlying question raised by the sources is profound, and it forces a societal reckoning with the true cost of reshoring essential industries like pharmaceuticals. They ask, we have offshored so much of our supply chains because we want to have inexpensive drugs. If we want to reverse this, we would really have to redesign our system. How much are we willing to spend?
That's the multi-billion-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is. And it's not merely an economic question. It's a strategic public health and national security one. Redesigning our pharmaceutical supply chain for complete domestic self-sufficiency would involve not just building factories, but cultivating a robust ecosystem for API production, specialized chemical manufacturing, and a highly skilled labor force. This would undoubtedly increase the base cost of many drugs, at least initially.
So the goal is laudable, secure, affordable drugs, but the method might be flawed.
That's the insight here. While the goal is paramount, the proposed tariff mechanism was arguably a blunt instrument. It failed to account for the deep complexities and interdependencies of the global pharmaceutical industry. It highlighted this tension between immediate political promises, lower drug costs, and the long-term economic and public health realities. It forces you, the listener, to consider the real trade-offs between cost, security, and access when discussing such critical supply chains. There are no easy answers. #outro.
Wow, what a wild deep dive that was into the intersection of trade policy, legal frameworks, and, well, sheer political showmanship.
It covered a lot of ground, didn't it?
It really did. We've seen how tariffs, which are intended as these straightforward economic tools, can sometimes become rhetorical weapons, diplomatic liabilities, and even, as our sources so vividly portrayed, the stuff of satirical legend. From weapons-grade olive branches to Mordor steel.
Exactly. This entire saga really reiterates the profound role that individual figures like Peter Navarro and his dynamic with President Trump played in shaping a truly unique and often chaotic approach to international trade and global relations. It just demonstrates how personality can profoundly influence policy and perception.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these sources highlight a critical tension that extends far beyond just trade policy. It's really about what happens when political rhetoric and the personalities of key figures diverge so sharply from established legal processes, from economic realities, from diplomatic norms.
Yeah.
What are the real-world consequences, even when policies are ultimately deemed phantom and maybe have little direct economic effect domestically? The ripple effect on credibility, on international trust, and on the perceived stability of a nation's governance can be substantial and really long-lasting.
Even if the tariffs themselves were smoke and mirrors, the act of doing it had consequences.
Precisely. Which raises an important question for you to consider as you navigate today's political landscape. In an increasingly interconnected world, what happens when a nation's economic strategy seems to rely more on performative declarations and the individual whims of leaders than on long-standing legal and diplomatic structures?
And how do we tell the difference?
And how do we, as informed citizens, develop the discernment necessary to differentiate between declared policy and the actual verifiable impact? It's getting harder, isn't it?
It really is.
Perhaps the lasting legacy of these tariff trends, as the sources call them, isn't just about trade deficits or specific duties. Maybe it's about the profound questions they've inadvertently posed about governance, accountability, and the very nature of truth in public discourse.
A lot to think about there.
It's a reminder, I think, that even in the age of spectacle, understanding the quiet mechanics of law, economics, and diplomacy remains absolutely crucial.